Okay, so we're back. So we're going to build one more page. We want to build a page that's going to process our save request, check the inputs, and if they're good, we'll save to the database. If they're no good, we'll show the user a message. So let's go ahead and make a new PHP page. And I'll save this one in my folder for today as save request.php. Because that's where our form action is targeting, is our save request page. So before we write the code, we'll kind of lay out the logic, we'll put all our comments on, plan out the steps, and then we can write the code one piece at a time. So the first thing we'll do is store the form inputs in variables. Now, when we built the save page before, the second thing we did was connect to the database. We're not going to do that yet. What we want to do is check each input for a valid entry. So if it's a text box, whether it's a single line or multi-line, we want to make sure the user didn't leave it blank. What are we going to want to check on our drop-down list? Yeah, that the value doesn't say select. We don't want to save the request if the user hasn't chosen a province. So we'll check each entry. Then we'll check if the form was complete.
Sorry.
And if the form's complete, what do we want to do?
Display it.
We're not going to display. Yeah, we'll save. So the first thing we're going to need to do in that case, if we're inserting or saving. Yeah, so now we'll connect at this point.
Can't you write one PHP file, connect to database, and every other?
Yes, we can, and we will do that. That will save us a lot of time connecting. The reason why for the first few weeks I want you to have to put the connection in every file is so that you get used to, that you actually learn what the connection string looks like. Eventually, yes, we'll make it so that we'll write one connection file and we can just reuse that each week. We won't have to rewrite it, but for the first 5 or 6 weeks, we're going to keep typing the connection out every time so that you learn it. But yes, eventually we want to stop doing that. That's a good point. So we'll set up the SQL, we'll execute the insert, we'll disconnect, and we'll show a confirmation message. But all of these steps will only happen if our form's complete. If the form's not complete, we're going to tell the user what they need to fix up, and we'll stop them. So the first part of this should be pretty simple. How many variables are we going to need?
5. 4.
We probably need 4, right? We've got 4 inputs. We've got name, we've got email, we have province, and we have reason.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? Or was there something else you were thinking of?
Was it ID?
No, well, the ID will get auto-generated in the database, so we don't need to store that one. So let's create variables. Normally, I like to let my variable names match the input names, which also match the column names in the database. That way, we're less likely to mess up with those names if we're using them 3 times. So if I go back to my request page for a minute, I've got name, email, province, and reason. So I'll use those same 4 variables. So we'll fill each one from a certain item in our post array. So we'll get 4 variables. Each one will hold one of the inputs from our form. Nothing different here from what we did back in week 2 when we were saving new data. And all of this stuff is going to be a repeat of what we did in week 2. So the new part is going to be this. Before we save anything, we want to validate each input and then check overall whether our form is good to save or whether we had any problems. It would be nice if we could check each input, if we didn't have to check each input individually, but we're pretty much stuck doing it one field at a time. Which is okay, because from a user point of view, if we give them a big form and they've left out a few things or made a few mistakes, we want to tell them exactly what they've done wrong, so that they know exactly what fields they need to go back and correct. So we're going to check each field individually. So we'll have some kind of condition here. So there's 2 functions in PHP that are similar. We basically just want to make sure the user entered something in the name field. So does anybody have an idea what PHP function we might be able to use that will check and evaluate whether our name variable has any kind of value in it?
Equals?
Close. You're close. There's actually a couple built-in functions in PHP we can check. The simplest one that we'll probably use is there's a built-in function called empty.
We were thinking too much.
Pretty neat? Yeah, you overthought it. And you can tell, we can tell it's a built-in function because when I type empty and open a bracket, right, my Expression Web code editor recognizes that function. So we just want to check our name variable. There's a similar function called isSet. So we could check if not is set, meaning that variable has not been given any value. So it's sort of the opposite of empty. And you could use either one. There are some semantic differences, but by and large they'll do the same thing. So if our name is empty, what do we want to do?
Go back to the
Yeah, let's display a message to the user to let them know that they're going to need to fill out that field. So we can just add on an echo. Say name is required. I'll put in a line break here because they might leave out other fields as well. We'll want to print out an error message on each line. Now I realize it's a fair bit of code to check for each field individually. We don't have to. We could just do one check for all 4 fields all in one line. I don't really recommend it. What would be the problem with checking name, email, province, and reason all in one line? It would work. But from a user point of view, why would it be better that we check each input individually?
We can tell them which is.
Right, because if we check all 4, well, the combinations of what somebody could leave out, there's a lot of different combinations. So we can really only give them a generic error saying your form was incomplete, but we haven't really guided them as to what else they have to do. It's much better if we check one field at a time, we can tell them exactly what they've done wrong. So you could do this all in one line if you want. It wouldn't be wrong, but I think we're going to give our user a better experience and we're helping them out more to check each field one at a time. So we'll check email the same way. So if our email is empty, and again, don't forget you need 2 brackets here because we've got one for our if condition and one bracket opening our empty function. And we have to close both of them. So if email is empty,
Can't we just put like a required field?
really good question. Why do we need to validate on the server? Couldn't we just add the required attribute here? We could. Okay, there's a couple of limitations. What's the problem with relying solely on, so required is an HTML5 attribute. Before HTML5, we didn't have that required attribute. What's the problem if we only rely on HTML5 for doing our validation.
Some browsers might not.
Right, some users are stuck with old browsers that aren't fully HTML5 compliant. And if you think that today in 2015 this isn't the case anymore, I have to tell you you're wrong, particularly in big organizations, right? I used to do work for Scotiabank, and as late as last year, they were using every workstation in every Scotiabank office, they used Internet Explorer 8. And every computer is identical. So an individual user had no ability, if they didn't like IE8, they couldn't upgrade it. They couldn't install Chrome or Firefox. The machines are totally locked down by the IT department. They don't give users access to change them at all. So users are stuck. So I was building things and they were working, and my client kept calling saying, this doesn't work on my browser. You forgot to check it in IE8. So particularly in big institutions, they want every computer to be the same. So for them to upgrade is a massive project. It takes a long time. So they tend to be really far behind, many cases, with technologies like new browsers. So this is certainly easier. It means we don't have to write any code, but we can't always rely on HTML5 validation. That's one issue. The other issue with HTML5 validation is they don't perform all the kinds of checks that we want. Required field checks they'll do. What other kinds of things, though, might we want to validate in inputs other than simply checking if something is blank or has a value? Think about on a registration page when you sign up for a website. What's one of the checks that's happening in terms of your inputs? Okay, a valid email is something that HTML5 can do, right? We could add type equals email here. So that will check the email format. What about passwords? How do you typically have to enter passwords if you're signing up for something?
8 characters, mixed numbers.
Okay, so it could be that we have password rules around password formats. We could potentially try to write a regular expression. It's a lot of code. How many password boxes do you usually get?
2.
2. What kind of validation script needs to run? Daniel? You're saying it.
This one equals that one.
Right, we want to check that the two values are equal. Well, HTML5 doesn't give you the ability to do that, right? We can validate that somebody's entered a password in each field, but we're still going to need to validate either with JavaScript on the client or with server-side script on the server once it's posted. We'll still want to make sure that those two values match. So there can be validation rules, or maybe if we've got country and state drop-downs, we want to make sure if our user picks United States that they don't pick a Canadian province. So it would be easier to validate that stuff on the server. So there's no right and no wrong. For your assignment, you can choose. You can use PHP validation or you can use HTML5 validation, but I'm going to show you how to do both. Right? We did HTML5 a couple weeks ago. Today we'll do validation on the server with PHP. And for any individual page, you can decide what makes the most sense. If HTML5 will do everything and you think all your users are going to probably have HTML5 devices, that's the easiest. But it may not handle all of the rules we want to enforce. So let's also show a message in the event they've left out the email. What about our province? Our province is never going to be empty, right? If the user doesn't pick anything, there's still going to be a default choice. So what should we be checking in terms of our province variable?
Equals, select.
You got it. So we'll want to check if province equals. Now you guys are familiar with equals because you've seen this syntax in Java, so it's no different. What's the difference between one equal sign and two equal signs? Every one of you is probably going to make this mistake sometime in this course, and I'll probably be the first one. So what's the difference between one equals and two? Right, so if we want to compare two values to see if they're the same, we're going to use double equals. If we use a single equal sign, we are setting the value on the left side of the equal sign to be the same as the value on the right side. So what value do we want to check here? We want to check if our province variable is equal to select. If I do this with 1 equals, province is always going to be equal to select because I'll be setting the value with a single equal sign. So this is a gotcha. For any C-based language, you're already familiar with this from Java. It's no different in PHP. We will probably all make this mistake at some point. So if province is equal to select, let's tell the user. And we'll check our reason, make sure it's not empty as well. So we'll check that the same way we did name and email. So we can use the empty function. So at this point, we've got 4 validation rules. Let's upload this page and just make sure that our validation rules work. If we submit a blank form, we should get 4 validation messages. And if we start putting in various inputs, we can check to make sure that the right error messages are showing up. So I'm going to upload my file. So I'm going to leave my form blank. I won't select the province. And I should get all 4 of these messages that I left everything out. If I go back to my form and start putting values in, if I put in a name, I should only get 3 error messages. If I put in an email, now I get 2 errors. I'll just check each message one at a time. I'll pick a province. And if I fill out the form completely, I should just get a blank screen. So just try your page out. Make sure all of the validation rules are firing properly. If they're not, then the first thing to check is how you've named everything. Do all of your names correspond? And notice, I'll just put in a single equal sign instead of the double equals. So even if I fill out the form this way, if I've used 1 equal signs rather than 2, it's always going to tell me province is required even though I picked the province, right? Because I'm setting my province value to be equal to select. So we want to make sure we've got double equals there.
Files will look correct.
Oh, did it just die?
Yeah. Maybe not really.
We almost made it through class.
You know.
We were close. I was bugging IT, and they did make some changes in the firewall last week, so it's been better, actually. This is the first time I've seen it go down since then.
Still not enough. Mainframe, same thing. Just crashes every single time. If they're 2 hours, then we'll leave.
Oh, no, it just works sometimes.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's the question now. We can check each input, but now, how are we going to know whether we're saving to the database or whether we've had any error messages? If we've had any error message, if we've displayed any of these statements, any one of these, we don't want to do this stuff, right? There's no point connecting to the database and running an insert if we didn't get all 4 values. So when we get down to this stage, after we've checked each input individually, how are we going to know whether we should be connecting and saving or whether we're stopping because we've already printed errors to the screen. So we've got two scenarios at this point. Either our form is complete or our form wasn't complete. But right now, how do we know? I'll rephrase the question. We don't know, so what will we need to add?
We have to set some kind of like a flag.
You got it. We're going to add one other variable that we can track that will tell us whether our form is complete or incomplete. So when we get down to this section, we can just evaluate that variable and know, yeah, we're going to proceed, or no, we've already spit out error messages, so we don't have to do anything else. So up at the top, I'm going to add one more variable. I'm just going to call it OK. We'll default it to true. So until we find an error, we'll assume the form is complete. So anytime we encounter an error and we print out an error message, right, any one of these echo statements could happen. 1, 2, 3, or all 4 of them, but we don't know which one it's going to be. So how can we use our OK variable? Anytime an error happens, what should we do?
Inside the if, you set it OK equals false.
You got it. So anytime after we print an error message, OK is now false. So if they leave out the email, the name, it becomes false. If they leave out the email too, we're just setting it from false to false, which is fine. I'll just add a comment, show an error message, and toggle the OK variable. So we'll do this in case of any error that happens. We've just got this simple Boolean flag. So make sure that goes inside of each if statement. It doesn't matter whether you put that before or after the echo commands. It doesn't matter what order those happen in. So now that we have that, how can we use that variable to determine whether we need to connect and save the information or whether we just can stop? Cindy? If. Yeah, so if what? What's our condition? Well, if OK is equal to false, we don't have to do anything, right? We've already printed all the errors to the screen. So, and because it's a Boolean, we can simply just say if OK. I mean, we could type it this way, if it's equal to true, but because it's a Boolean, these are equivalent. And I'm all in favor of writing less code when we can write less code. So if it's more descriptive to you to do it this way, sure thing, go for it. But these are equivalent. So now, if our variable's OK, all of this has to happen. I got to put curly braces around this whole block, right? Because we're only doing these things if we never encountered an error message during our validation. I'll check how FileZilla is doing. It's still thinking. Oh. There we go. It's back. Hopefully it can hang on for about 10 more minutes for us.
We'll see.
So the rest of this code, now there's nothing new here. Now our code is going to be identical to what we did in week 2 when we were saving on our athlete page. We're going to connect. We'll write an SQL insert. We'll add each value in a parameter. So that way if we have special characters like single quotes in any of the fields, they won't crash our SQL command. We'll execute the command, we'll disconnect, and we'll just show a message to the user. So I'll go through it with you, but you guys by now can probably do a fair bit of this on your own. So we'll set up the new connection. I assume the connection line's probably starting to look familiar because this is probably the 8th or 10th time you've had to do it over the month so far. So that's the idea, that it becomes familiar to you. And we'll turn on the SQL debugging. So I'll create a new command object. Oops. So here's the start of our SQL command. We're using our request table. Here are the 4 column names we're going to insert into. Notice again, everything's lowercase, there's no capital letters. How are we going to pass in the values? Again, we could just directly inject our variables, which isn't a great idea, because if there's special characters like a single quote in there, our SQL statement's going to crash. So what are we going to use instead? We used it 2 weeks ago.
We bind the parameter.
Yeah, we're going to put in placeholders or parameters into our SQL instead, and then we'll bind each parameter to one of our variables. So our syntax for those parameters is just to prefix each one with a colon. So I'll create 4 parameters. And those parameter names, they just match my column names. We've used colons instead to indicate it's a parameter or a placeholder. So I'll change my comment. Not only are we setting up the SQL, but we want to add each value using a bound parameter. So we'll need 1 line of code for each parameter. Name, email, province, request. All of them are strings, but they're different length strings. So we may have to check our database just to confirm how big each field is. So first we'll fill our name parameter from our name variable up above. So that holds the text box input. It's a string data type. I think it's 50 characters in our table. I can just go and check. So name and email are 50, province is 2, and reason is 5,000. So we'll supply those lengths with each parameter. So 50 for the first 2. So only 2 characters for province. But up to 5,000 is probably excessive. And to execute this, we'll just call our execute method So after line 54 runs, that value, all those values should be in the database. We can drop our connection. And show the user a message. So I had CMD here, that needs to be con. So I'll try and submit my form again. It says my request was saved. If we want to check, I can just go back to my database. Here's my request. But if I go back to my form and I leave anything out, we get a validation message. And if I run my code again, still only have one record. So we're not saving unless all of the fields are completed and our OK variable set to true. So this is the other piece that you need for your assignment. Okay, we've already done the saving, so now we've done it twice. So you're going to have to build a form that saves. You can choose any kind of validation you want, HTML5, or use PHP to validate on the server, and make sure that your form has at least one drop-down list included. So really, the two pages we've just built, the request and the save request, along with the page you built for Lab 1, that's pretty much everything you need for the assignment, is 3 pages.